You know that feeling right after a massive, long-awaited celebration. The confetti is swept up, the crowds have finally gone home, and there's this creeping, unsettling realization that the monumental change you just spent all night cheering for, well, it might actually just be an illusion.
Yeah, it's like you think you've crossed the finish line into an entirely new era, only to realize you've just, walked onto a different section of the exact same track.
Right, exactly. And that historical hangover is exactly what we are exploring today for you, the listener. We're doing a deep dive into one specific, incredibly volatile decade. We're pulling from Daniel Branch's meticulously researched book, Kenya. Between Hope and Despair, 1963 to 2011, specifically, we're looking at Chapter 8.
Right, which covers the period from 2002 to 2011. And our mission today is to cut through the sweeping history, to extract those crucial moments that explain how political hope can violently unravel, and importantly, how human identity itself gets weaponized by the people in charge.
It really is a deeply complex, often heartbreaking period to look at.
It is, yeah. But the mechanics of what happened in Kenya during these years, they offer profound lessons about the hidden architecture of power and democracy. These are patterns you can see operating all over the world today.
So true. So let's set the scene. The year is 2002. Kenya is experiencing what the book describes as a carnival mood and a sunny outlook. Kibaki and his UNRC coalition are taking power.
Right, and for the citizens in the streets, this was supposed to be the definitive end of decades of entrenched single-party authoritarianism under the outgoing president, Daniel Arap Moi.
And to understand the sheer euphoria of that moment, you really have to understand what the NRRC coalition actually represented, right?
Exactly. NRC stands for the National Rainbow Coalition. For years, Kenya's political opposition had been heavily fractured, often along ethnic lines. But in 2002, those diverse leaders finally put aside their rivalries and banded together with one singular goal, which was to vote out Moi's regime.
And it worked. Kibaki won. So on paper, democracy did exactly what it's supposed to do. The people voted for change, and the long-ruling party was ousted.
Yeah, on paper, it looked perfect.
But right behind the curtain of that street celebration, a very dark shadow was lurking. Okay, let's unpack this.
To really see that shadow, we have to look at a specific moment just before that handover of power. It was March 2002 at a political rally in the Kariobangi neighborhood of Nairobi.
Okay.
So outgoing President Daniel Arap Moi is on stage. He knows his time is up and he has to step down. But instead of quietly fading away, he is actively parading his chosen political descendants before the crowd, a group the media often called his Young Turks.
And these are names that go on to absolutely dominate the next decade of Kenyan politics, right? You had Musalia Mudavadi, Raila Odinga, Uhuru Kenyatta, and William Ruto.
Yes, exactly. And on that stage, Moi turned to these men in front of a massive crowd and asked them a deeply chilling question. He asked, "If I leave for you the leadership, will you kill? Will you protect the country properly?"
Wait, really? He actually stood on a public stage and asked his successors if they would kill?
He did. It's shocking to hear out loud. But the historical irony here is just devastating.
Oh.
Because 6 years later, those very men, the ones Moi publicly anointed on that stage, would be accused of either participating in or orchestrating horrific national violence.
Wow. It sounds like a company firing its deeply toxic CEO, but keeping the exact same executive board that the CEO personally trained, and somehow expecting a totally new corporate culture to emerge. Didn't anyone at the time realize that these supposedly new coalition leaders were really just the old guard wearing different ties?
What's fascinating here is that, in this case, those executives already knew all the passwords to the company bank accounts.
Right, of course.
Moi was incredibly astute about the architecture of power he had built over decades. He successfully identified the exact men who would maneuver to the top over the next 10 years.
So yes, the opposition candidate, Mwai Kibaki, won the election in 2002.
Exactly. But Moi's political ascendants were already perfectly positioned within the new system. The faces at the very top shifted slightly, but the underlying machinery of how politics was played was left completely untouched.
When you say the underlying machinery, we are talking about the patronage system, right?
Yeah, precisely.
The idea that political power isn't about public service, but about capturing state resources and distributing them to your specific loyalists and ethnic base?
That's it exactly. The NRC coalition won the election, but they didn't dismantle the patronage machine. They just took the keys to it.
Ah, I see.
And because that machine requires constant feeding, The leaders within the coalition almost immediately turned on each other to secure the biggest pieces of the pie for their own camps.
Which explains how a country goes from a carnival mood to an absolute powder keg. Because the underlying system was never fixed, the stakes for the next election became an explosive winner-take-all scenario.
And that pressure cooker detonated in 2007.
Right, so let's look at that 2007 election. The country goes to the polls, the early results roll in, and it looks like the challenger, Raila Odinga, is winning.
Yeah, a change in leadership looks certain at first.
Then suddenly, the counting process becomes shrouded in confusion. The very next day, the incumbent, Mwai Kibaki, is hurriedly declared the victor by a surprising, highly disputed margin. Kibaki supporters celebrate, but almost instantly, the country catches fire.
The speed of the escalation was staggering, and Daniel Branch highlights just how devastating this was on the ground.
Yeah, the book has some really harrowing accounts.
It does. Take the story of Salamé Jerry, a Kikuyu resident living in Busia. Almost immediately after the disputed results were announced, people perceived to be from her ethnic group were targeted.
That's terrifying.
She was violently kicked out of her burning house and had to flee to a local police station where she ended up living as a refugee for 8 months.
8 months in a police station. And then there is the account of Michael Mwangi, a retired headmaster living in North Kinangop.
Right. Who had already survived previous ethnic clashes in the 1990s.
Yeah, but in early 2008, he watched from his property as his neighbors' farms were set on fire by a Kalenjin militia. He took hundreds of displaced people into his own compound for safety until his own house was surrounded and set on fire too.
And he was only saved by a last-minute police arrival. The sheer scale of the violence left hundreds of thousands of people totally defenseless.
But the most terrifying detail in Michael Mwangi's account is what the authorities were doing before that last-minute rescue. He noted that the neighboring homes were burning while the police just stood by and watched.
Yeah, that detail is chilling.
Here's where it gets really interesting for me. With the police just watching, was this violence actually a spontaneous reaction to rigged votes, or was this an orchestrated political strategy exploiting the chaos?
If we connect this to the bigger picture, the evidence suggests this was a highly orchestrated political strategy.
Really? So it wasn't just raw anger boiling over?
Well, there was genuine, spontaneous anger over the vote count. But that raw anger was immediately harnessed, funded, and directed by local political elites. For decades, politicians had normalized violence as a legitimate tool for settling electoral disputes.
But how does a politician actually orchestrate that? I mean, you don't just hand regular people a weapon and tell them to attack the family next door.
You don't just hand them a weapon, you hand them a narrative. Politicians and local elites had spent months leading up to the election, priming these communities.
Priming them how?
They exploited local vernacular radio stations and community meetings to spread hate speech. They paid unemployed youths to form militias. They strategically mapped out areas where opposition voters lived.
With the goal of driving them out.
Exactly, with the calculated goal of violently evicting them so they wouldn't be around for the next election cycle.
Wow. And the core of that narrative, the psychological weapon they used to convince people to turn on their neighbors, was deeply tied to history and land ownership, right? Particularly in the Rift Valley.
Yes, they relied heavily on creating the myth of the outsider. This is often called the myth of Ottawathani, which is the idea of being the original indigenous son of the soil.
There's a story in the book about Milka Kiri that perfectly illustrates this. She lived in Molo, and during the post-election violence, she was forced from her home by a militia.
And the specific justification they gave her was that the Rift Valley belonged exclusively to the Kalenjin people.
Right. They claimed they were the indigenous owners given the land at independence, and she, as a Kikuyu, was an outsider who had to leave.
But the book aggressively pushes back on this myth of pure indigenous belonging. Branch asserts that Kikuyu have just as much deep, mobile history in the Rift Valley as the Kalenjin, the Maasai, or the Samburu.
Because East African history is fundamentally defined by movement and trade, isn't it?
Absolutely. Pastoralism and open boundaries were the norm. The idea that there are pure ethnic borders where one group exclusively belongs and another is an invader is simply a political fairy tale.
It sounds like the elites are intentionally forcing the public to fight over recognition, like who truly belongs here, to completely distract them from redistribution, which is who actually controls the wealth and land. Is this just the ultimate political sleight of hand?
That is a brilliant way to put it. That tension between recognition and redistribution is one of the most powerful insights in this history. And it is a playbook used by elites all over the world.
It really is.
Think about the reality on the ground in Kenya at that time. You have millions of jobless, landless youth who are furious at a system that has failed them. If those youth look upward, they see a wealthy political establishment hoarding the country's resources.
Which is terrifying for the political elite.
Exactly. So what do the politicians do? They invent a narrative of ethnic grievance. They tell those youths, the reason you don't have a job isn't because we stole the money, it's because that family next door doesn't belong here.
They manipulate the public into turning their valid anger sideways against their own impoverished neighbors instead of directing it upward at the people actually in charge.
Exactly. It redirects class anger into ethnic violence.
But amid all that orchestrated division, there's another side to this period that the sources highlight, and we absolutely have to talk about it. Because while the political class was dividing the country, regular people were risking their lives to hold it together.
The humanitarian courage shown by ordinary citizens during this crisis was staggering, and it often gets buried under the broader political narrative.
Take the story of Mama Kiplagat. She was a 29-year-old Kalenjin woman living in burnt forest. During the absolute height of the violence, she hid her Kikuyu neighbor, a widow, and her 3 children in her home.
Imama Kiplagat knew the stakes. She knew that if her own community found out she was sheltering them, the local militia would likely kill her.
She lived in such terror that she worried her own young children might accidentally betray her secret to the neighbors. But she did it anyway. She risked her life for a neighbor.
And she wasn't an anomaly. While 500,000 Kenyans were displaced, countless people took refuge with strangers who completely defied the ethnic narratives being pushed by the state.
That grassroots bravery creates an incredibly stark contrast with what the political elites were doing. Because eventually international mediators step in to stop the bleeding. A power-sharing government is forced upon the leaders, bringing Kibaki and Raila Odinga into a massive coalition.
Right. The violence finally ends. But instead of using this truce to heal the nation and address the root causes of the crisis, the new government essentially devolves into a bipartisan corruption syndicate.
It's as if 2 rival mob bosses finally called a truce, not to bring peace to the neighborhood, but just so they could team up and rob the town bank together without any distractions.
That's exactly what it was. And in this case, the bank they were robbing included the National Maize Reserves. The head of the Kenya Anti-Corruption Commission at the time, Aaron Ringera, literally described the actions of the new government as a feeding frenzy.
To put that in context for the listener, the maize scandal involved politicians illegally selling off subsidized national food reserves for massive personal profit during a severe national drought.
It was pure extraction. Ringera's successor, Patrick Lumumba, noted that practically every single member of the country's bloated cabinet was implicated.
And the cabinet was massive, right? Like 42 members.
Yes, specifically because Kibaki and Odinga had to invent government positions to pay off every single ethnic voting bloc that had supported them. They were even caught profiteering from the sale of Kenyan embassy properties overseas.
Unbelievable. And while the cabinet is enjoying this feeding frenzy, the people trying to expose it are paying the ultimate price. The book mentions the assassination of whistleblowers and human rights activists, like Kamau Kingra and John Paul Ulu from the Oscar Foundation.
Right, they were investigating police death squads.
And they were murdered in broad daylight just hours after a government spokesman publicly demonized their organization. And unsurprisingly, no arrests followed.
Which forces us to ask, how does a society reconcile this dual reality? On one hand, you have immense civic courage, and on the other, profound state impunity.
It's a huge contradiction.
By 2010, the political narrative has shifted yet again. Odinga and Kenyatta, 2 men who are on opposite sides of the bloody 2007 divide, are seen at a party celebrating the passage of a new constitution.
They are actively attempting to project a narrative to the world that the country has turned the page and the 2008 violence is firmly in the past.
But the past refuses to stay buried, because shortly after that celebration, Kenyatta receives a summons from the International Criminal Court, the ICC.
And to clarify how that happens, the ICC generally only steps in when a domestic government is either unwilling or unable to prosecute massive crimes against humanity. Because the Kenyan political elite protected their own, the International Court intervened, charging key figures with orchestrating the post-election violence.
Which brings us to the core dilemma the book presents for the everyday citizen. It's encapsulated in a brilliant metaphor, the leopards and the goats.
Yes, this analogy, I haven't been able to stop thinking about it. It essentially says that when election time rolls around, the voters, the citizens, are the goats. They line up at the ballot box, hoping to vote for a leader who will protect them, build roads, and fund schools.
But when they look at the ballot, they realize that the only options the political machinery has allowed them to choose from are just different types of leopards.
Exactly.
The entire electoral ecosystem is structurally designed to ensure that only predators ever make it onto the ballot.
Mm.
The patronage machine filters out anyone who won't play the game.
So, how does the nation move forward when those are the only choices?
John Githongo, a famous Kenyan whistleblower who had to flee the country for his own safety, returned to survey the post-2008 landscape.
Yeah.
And he summed up the painful reality of this era perfectly.
What did he say?
He said, "There are no saints in this story. We're going to have to make do with what we have. It's imperfect." The book describes Kenya during this era as a schizophrenic or half-made place.
Because you have this incredibly vibrant, free, and courageous civil society, the fearless journalists, the activists, the citizens like Mama Kiplagat, existing in the exact same space at the exact same time as a terrifying, predatory political authoritarianism.
It is a profound paradox. Citizens experienced economic growth, but still couldn't find work. They actively voted in elections, but didn't truly experience the results of democracy.
But the ultimate takeaway from these sources isn't despair, is it?
No, not at all. It's the profound agency and resilience of the Kenyan people themselves.
So what does this all mean for you, the listener? Why does this specific decade in Kenyan history matter to you listening to this today, perhaps sitting in a completely different country or political context?
That's the million-dollar question.
It matters because it proves that a society's spirit can survive even when its political architecture is fundamentally broken. The sources highlight the sheer endurance of the entrepreneurs, the hopeful youth, and the everyday citizens who motor on faith and enterprise.
They build their businesses, support their neighbors, and push for truth, flatly refusing to be entirely defined by the leopards in power.
Right. The political machinery may be designed to extract and divide, but the society itself remains fiercely dynamic.
It is a testament to the fact that people will always find ways to create meaning, community, and progress in the very spaces that the state neglects or actively attacks.
Let's do a quick recap of the journey we've been on. We started with the false hope of the 2002 election, where new faces successfully masked the old patronage machinery.
Then we moved through the tragic manipulations of the 2007 and 2008 elections, exploring the mechanics of how elites weaponized historical grievances to turn citizens against each other.
And we arrived at the stark reality of the power-sharing government, a corrupt feeding frenzy that was bravely countered by everyday humanitarianism and relentless whistleblowers.
It really is a masterclass in understanding the difference between the superficial illusion of change and the actual structural dismantling of power.
And that brings us to our final provocative thought for today. We so often view the simple act of holding an election as the ultimate cure-all for a nation's woes. We assume that if people can just cast a vote, democracy is working.
But if the underlying system is structurally designed so that only leopards can ever secure the funding and power to reach the ballot box, how much power does the goat actually have on election day?
It's a challenge for you, the listener, to look closely at your own local and national elections. Are we actually choosing our leaders, or are we just picking the leopard with the best marketing? Think about that the next time you see the confetti fall and the politicians declare a new era. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive. We respect your time. Keep feeding your curiosity, and we'll see you next time.